My name is Miranda. I'm 28 years old, and tonight I realize that my biological parents are actually my most ruthless creditors. We were standing in the grand hall of our family's Gothic mansion in Savannah, surrounded by the clinking of crystal glasses and the fake laughter of the elite when my world finally fractured. My father stepped onto the podium holding up a sparkling key and announced to all the guests, "To Silas, my son, the only worthy heir to this family legacy, I present this Ferrari to start the next chapter of your life." The room erupted in applause as my brother stepped forward, his face smug as he glared at me. But immediately after, my mother approached, not to hug me, but to thrust a thick envelope into my hand. She whispered, her voice as cold as ice. "And here is your part. A detailed invoice for every cent we've spent raising you since the day you were born. Pay back what you owe, then you can dream about entering this social circle." I stood frozen in place, opening the envelope under the mocking gazes of the crowd. Inside weren't just absurd numbers. On the very last page, I gasped as I saw a line with my own signature under a property mortgage addendum, a signature that looked hauntingly perfect, yet I was certain I had never put pen to paper for it. I looked at the brilliant Ferrari outside, then at the forged ink in my hand, and thought to myself, "Fine, if this is how you want to play, I will end it in a way you never saw coming." Before I reveal my plan to reclaim every penny and kick these parasites out of my life, if you find this injustice unacceptable, please hit like and subscribe right now. Your action gives me the motivation to carry out justice. Now let's go back to that fateful night in Savannah where all the dirty secrets began to surface. The rain lashed against my windshield like 1,000 tiny needles, the rhythmic slap of the wipers, the only sound filling the cabin of my car as I sped away from that suffocating mansion. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white, but my mind was miles away, drifting back to a quiet office 5 years ago. I could still see my father, Clarence Howard, sitting behind his mahogany desk, with his head in his hands, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. He told me the family architectural firm, a legacy built over 3 generations, was days away from a total collapse. Then my mother, Sylvia Lucille, had placed her hand on my shoulder, her voice trembling with a calculated desperation that I now realized was a performance. She spoke of family sacrifice and blood loyalty, telling me that as the eldest daughter with a pristine credit score and a fresh professional license, I was the only bridge between them and ruin. Because I loved them, I didn't hesitate. I remember the cold feel of the pen as I signed a personal guarantee for a massive restructuring loan, a document I barely skimmed because I believed a daughter shouldn't need to audit her own parents. I thought I was signing a lifeline for a business. In reality, I was signing a blank check for their gluttony. Over the following years, every time Sylvia called me crying about unforeseen expenses or emergency repairs for our ancestral home, I redirected my hard-earned bonuses from my firm in Chicago straight into their accounts. I was working 80-hour weeks restoring historical landmarks and breathing life into dead stone, while they were breathing the life out of my bank account. I had become a ghost in my own life, a mere utility to keep the Howard name polished in the high society of Savannah. As I pulled into a rest stop, the fluorescent lights of the parking lot reflecting in the puddles, I pulled out my laptop. A bitter irony surged through me. When I had reorganized the firm's digital infrastructure years ago, I had retained a high-level administrative bypass to their legacy accounting software. They were too technologically illiterate to even know it existed. With a few frantic keystrokes, I bypassed the firewalls and dove into the raw data of the Howard Family Trust. What I saw made the blood in my veins turn to ice. The numbers didn't just fail to match the sob stories they fed me. They told a story of systematic, cold-blooded embezzlement. Clarence hadn't been losing money to market fluctuations as he claimed. Instead, the logs showed massive recurring transfers disguised as consulting fees that flowed directly into accounts controlled by my brother Griffin Silas. even more disturbing were the timestamps on the property mortgage addendums. One specific document dated only 6 months ago claimed I had attended a board meeting in Savannah to authorize a second mortgage on the mansion. I was in London for a restoration project during that entire month. Seeing my digitized signature attached to a document I had never seen felt like a physical blow to the chest. It wasn't just greed. It was forgery. They hadn't just used my money. They had stolen my identity to secure their luxury. Every cent I had sent home to save the business had actually been liquidated to pay for high-stakes investments and offshore accounts I was never meant to find. The family I thought I was protecting was actually a predatory syndicate, and I was their primary target. The blue light of my dual monitors was the only thing illuminating my office in Chicago, casting long, jagged shadows against the blueprints pinned to the walls. I sat perfectly still, the silence of the skyscraper broken only by the hum of the ventilation and the aggressive clicking of my mouse as I pulled up the supplementary credit card statements linked to my primary business account. For years, I had allowed Griffin Silas to hold a card for emergency use only, a decision rooted in a misplaced sense of sisterly protection. But as the PDF pages scrolled by my stomach did a slow, nauseating flip. These weren't emergencies. There were dozens of wire transfers, each totaling 6 figures, funneled into an obscure, high-risk cryptocurrency exchange I had never heard of. My brother wasn't just spending my money on luxury clothes or expensive dinners anymore. He was burning my entire life's work on a desperate, volatile gamble. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, rubbing my aching temples as a wave of pure exhaustion washed over me. I thought about the last 3 months, a period where I had barely slept 4 hours a night. I had been grinding away on the restoration project for the historic library downtown, meticulously hand-drawing structural reinforcements to ensure every stone remained true to its 19th century origin. My back ached from leaning over drafting tables, and my eyes were perpetually bloodshot from staring at CAD files until the sun rose over Lake Michigan. I was literally trading my physical and mental health to earn the capital required to cover the massive financial deficit Silas was creating. Every bonus check I earned, every commission from a high-profile client was being liquidated within seconds by a man who had never held a real job in his life. The contrast was staggering and felt like a physical insult. I opened my phone and scrolled through social media, my thumb trembling slightly. There he was. Silas had posted a photo of himself on a private yacht, a glass of expensive champagne in one hand, and a gold watch gleaming on his wrist. The caption read, "Self-made and staying focused. Financial freedom is a mindset." The irony was so thick it was suffocating. He was posing in front of a world he couldn't afford, fueled by the sweat and labor of a sister he treated like a bottomless ATM. While I was calculating load-bearing weights and arguing with contractors to save a few $100s on materials he was throwing away, hundreds of thousands on digital coins, chasing a jackpot that would never come. He lived in a house of mirrors, convinced of his own brilliance, while I was the one holding the structural beams together so the whole roof didn't come crashing down on our family name. Just as I was about to close my laptop and head to the small sofa in the corner of my office for a few hours of restless sleep, my phone buzzed with a high-priority notification. It was an automated alert from my private savings bank, a secure account I used for my long-term investment portfolio. My heart skipped a beat as I read the message. Security alert. A large cash withdrawal request of $500,000 is pending. Please verify the attached authorization form. I clicked the link with cold, numb fingers. There, it was a scanned document bearing my name, my personal information, and that same hauntingly perfect signature I had seen back in Savannah. Someone had walked into a branch and attempted to drain my last line of defense using a forged power of attorney. They weren't just taking my surplus anymore. They were coming for my foundation. The line had been crossed, and the realization that my own flesh and blood was willing to leave me destitute for a gamble turned my lingering sadness into a sharp, focused rage. The air in the private conference room was sterile, smelling faintly of expensive leather and old paper. Mr. Henderson, a senior partner with a reputation for surgical precision in financial litigation, adjusted his spectacles as he spread the documents across the mahogany table. I didn't need to look at them again. The jagged lines of the forged signatures burned behind my eyelids. The silence between us was heavy, broken only by the distant muffled sounds of Chicago traffic 30 floors below. I pointed directly at the second mortgage addendum on the Savannah mansion and the unauthorized power of attorney that had nearly drained my savings. My voice was low but steady, devoid of the tremors that had plagued me just days ago. I confirmed to him that Clarence Howard had not only misappropriated funds, but had committed outright felony forgery. Every stroke of that pen was a betrayal recorded in ink, a desperate attempt to sustain a lifestyle they hadn't earned. Mr. Henderson leaned back, his eyes searching mine for any sign of hesitation. He began to outline the standard procedure: filing a police report, initiating a criminal investigation, and letting the district attorney take the lead. It would have been the easy path away to see them in handcuffs and clear my name. But I wasn't looking for a messy public spectacle that could linger in the courts for years. I wanted something more absolute. I wanted a total, clean excision of their influence from my life. I explained my alternative strategy, a cold, calculated financial maneuver that shifted the battleground from a criminal courtroom to the world of debt acquisition. I told him I wasn't interested in being a victim seeking restitution. I wanted to become the authority they were forced to answer to. Under Henderson's expert guidance, we moved with ghost-like efficiency over the next 48 hours. I utilized my private investment fund capital I had spent a decade building through grueling restoration projects to establish a domestic limited liability company. We titled it Vance Restorations LLC, a name that sounded professional and innocuous, a perfect cloak for my intentions. My primary goal was the primary mortgage on the Savannah Gothic mansion. I knew from my internal audits that Clarence had been falling behind on payments hidden beneath a mountain of credit card debt and Silas's failed crypto ventures. The bank was already eyeing the property for potential foreclosure. Through my LLC and a network of silent financial partners I had cultivated in the architecture industry, we initiated a quiet negotiation with the holding bank. We weren't just asking for information, we were making an aggressive offer to purchase the distressed debt in its entirety. The process was a complex dance of legal filings and wire transfers, a symphony of paperwork that slowly turned the tide in my favor. By the time the ink dried on the final acquisition agreement, I was no longer just the daughter who paid the bills. I had become the primary lineholder of my parents' sanctuary. I sat in that quiet room holding the deed of trust that now belonged to me, feeling the immense weight of the power I had just seized. Henderson asked if I felt a sense of relief now that the house was technically safe from external creditors. I looked him dead in the eye, my expression unreadable. I told him quite clearly that saving the family legacy was never my intention. I didn't buy that debt to preserve their comfort or to give them a second chance at my expense. I looked at the golden keys on the table and felt a chilling clarity. I didn't rescue that house, I bought the rights to it so I could take it back. The humidity of a Savannah morning hung heavy over the manicured lawns of the Howard estate, but the atmosphere inside the Gothic mansion was far more stifling. Chaos erupted the moment the first sunbeams hit the gravel driveway. I had spent the previous night systematically deactivating every financial artery that kept their world breathing, and by dawn, the system began to flatline. The first casualty was Griffin Silas's pride. A heavy-duty flatbed truck from a local repossession agency rumbled up the drive, its yellow lights flashing mockingly against the ivy-covered stone walls. Silas sprinted out in his silk pajamas, screaming at the top of his lungs, but the repo agents were indifferent to his pedigree. Since the lease payments which had been automatically drafted from my business account were now terminated, the red Ferrari was no longer his playground. I watched through the doorbell camera as the car was winched onto the truck, the metallic screech of the cables echoing like a death knell for the family's vanity. Within an hour, my phone became a battlefield of toxic notifications. Clarence Howard called first, his voice trembling not with regret, but with a feral, entitlement-driven rage. He didn't ask why I had stopped the payments. He demanded to know how I dared to embarrass him in front of the neighbors. When I remained silent, he shifted his tactics to a level of cowardice I hadn't thought possible. He contacted the primary lending bank and attempted to deflect the looming foreclosure by throwing me under the bus. He told the loan officers that I was the sole administrator of the family finances and that any missed payments or irregularities were entirely my mismanagement. He shamelessly urged them to pursue me for the arrears, trying to sacrifice my career and reputation to buy himself another month of luxury. It was a calculated betrayal, a father attempting to indict his daughter to save a pile of bricks and mortar. Sylvia Lucille's reaction was even more insidious, targeting the very foundation of my professional life. She knew that as an architect, my reputation for integrity was my most valuable asset. In a desperate bid to force my hand, she drafted a deceptive email and sent it to my largest restoration clients in Chicago. She portrayed herself as a grieving mother, claiming that I had suffered a mental breakdown and was unlawfully withholding family funds meant for historical preservation. She painted me as unstable and untrustworthy, hoping that the threat of losing my business would bring me back to heel. Sitting in my quiet office hundreds of miles away, I read the CC'd messages from confused clients, feeling the last lingering threads of my familial affection snap like brittle glass. They weren't just parasites. They were actively trying to burn down the house I had built for myself just because I refused to let them live in the basement for free. The final straw came when a formal notice arrived in my inbox from the bank's legal department, echoing the lies Clarence had fed them. They were threatening to initiate a fraud investigation based on his claims of my financial negligence. The irony was biting. The man whose lifestyle I had funded for years was now trying to paint me as the thief. I felt a surge of cold, focused adrenaline as I looked at the files Henderson had prepared. Their deceit, their utter lack of a moral compass provided the perfect justification for the final phase of my plan. They had spent the morning trying to convince the world that I was the problem, unaware that I was now the only person who actually owned the roof over their heads. The stage was set for the ultimate reckoning, and I was no longer interested in a quiet exit. I was ready to let the entire structure fall, ensuring they were the only ones caught in the rubble. The heavy glass doors of my Chicago studio nearly shattered as Clarence Howard kicked them open, his face a terrifying shade of crimson. Behind him, Sylvia Lucille was already wailing a calculated, loud performance designed to draw the attention of my staff and clients. Even Griffin Silas was there, leaning against my reception desk with a sneer, though the loss of his Ferrari had clearly stripped away his usual bravado. Clarence didn't wait for an invitation. He stormed into my private office and slammed his fist onto my mahogany desk, scattering my architectural drafts. He began screaming about filial abandonment and elder abuse, claiming that my decision to cut off their funds was a criminal act. He threatened to drag me through every court in Georgia, swearing he would see my professional license revoked for financial negligence and theft of family legacy. It was a desperate, ugly display of a man who realized his golden teat had finally run dry. I didn't rise from my chair. I didn't even flinch. I waited until his breath hitched and Sylvia's fake sobs subsided into a tense silence. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, I slid 2 thick blue folders across the polished surface of the desk. I watched Clarence's eyes dart toward them, his arrogance flickering for the first time. The first folder contained the forensic handwriting analysis reports, official documents proving that the signatures on the second mortgage and the power of attorney were fraudulent. I told him, my voice as cold as a winter morning on Lake Michigan, that these papers were enough to put him in a federal penitentiary for over a decade. The room went deathly quiet. Sylvia's face went pale, her performative grief vanishing, instantly replaced by a raw, naked terror. They had come here to bully a daughter. They found themselves facing a prosecutor. But the second folder was the true killing blow. I watched Clarence's hands tremble as he opened it, skimming through the acquisition agreements and the deed of trust. I explained the reality of the situation with surgical precision. While they had been busy trying to smear my name to the bank, I had been busy buying the bank. Through Vance Restorations LLC, I had acquired their distressed mortgage in its entirety. I was no longer just the daughter who paid their bills. I was officially their landlord and their primary lien holder. The irony was absolute. According to the very contracts Clarence had forged to exploit my credit, I now held the legal right to accelerate the debt and seize the collateral, their precious Gothic sanctuary in Savannah. The air seemed to vanish from the room as the weight of my words sank in. I leaned forward, looking my father directly in the eye, seeing the shattered remnants of his pride. I told him that since the mortgage was now in default due to his mismanagement, I was initiating an immediate foreclosure. I wasn't giving them months or weeks to negotiate. I informed them that they had exactly 24 hours to vacate the premises before the locks were changed and their belongings were moved to the curb. Silas tried to speak, his voice cracking, but I cut him off with a single look. I told them they had spent years treating me like an asset to be liquidated, and now I was simply returning the favor. As security arrived to escort them out, the look of utter devastation on their faces provided a payoff more satisfying than any amount of money. They had lost everything to the very child they thought they could control, and for the first time in 28 years, I was the only one in the room with the power to walk away. The morning mist clung to the Spanish moss hanging from the ancient oaks as I stood before the iron gates of the Savannah estate one last time. The Gothic mansion, once a symbol of my family's unearned prestige, was now silent, its windows dark, and its doors sealed with official foreclosure notices. The heavy brass keys felt cold and surprisingly light in my palm, a hollow weight compared to the years of financial bondage they represented. I had no intention of stepping inside to reclaim old memories or sift through the wreckage of our shared past. I had already signed the listing agreement to sell the property to a historical preservation group. To me, this was no longer a home. It was a toxic asset that had finally been liquidated. I turned my back on the stone walls, feeling a profound sense of closure that no amount of money could ever provide. The fall of the Howard Empire was as swift as it was public. Deprived of my protection and the steady flow of my income, the reality of their choices finally caught up with them. Clarence Howard and Sylvia Lucille were currently mired in a federal investigation into credit fraud and tax evasion, their once immaculate reputation in Savannah society reduced to ash. With their assets frozen and their credit scores destroyed, they were forced to move into a cramped one-bedroom apartment in a dilapidated part of town, far from the country clubs and gala dinners they once frequented. Griffin Silas suffered the most humiliating transformation of all. Stripped of his designer watches and his leased vanity, he was now working double shifts as a dockloader at the Savannah port, his soft hands now blistered and raw from moving crates he used to ignore. The circles he once moved in had erased his name before the ink on the foreclosure was even dry. A week later, as I was preparing to leave Georgia for good, I found myself stopped at a traffic light near the docks. I saw them, Clarence, Sylvia, and Silas, standing by the roadside looking like shadows of the people I once knew. They recognized my car and swarmed toward it, their faces pressed against the glass, mouths moving in a desperate, silent plea for one more handout, one more chance to exploit my guilt. Clarence pounded on the window, his eyes wild with a mixture of rage and begging. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting calmly on the steering wheel. I didn't roll down the window. I didn't offer a single word of comfort or a penny of support. I simply looked straight ahead, waiting for the light to turn green. When it did, I drove away without a backward glance, leaving the ghosts of my past in the rearview mirror where they belonged. This journey taught me a brutal but necessary lesson about the architecture of human relationships. We are often told that family is a bond that requires unconditional sacrifice, regardless of the cost to our own souls. But I realized that blood is not a contract for self-destruction. Love without boundaries is not devotion. It is an invitation to be plundered. Personal boundaries are the load-bearing walls of our character, and if we allow others to knock them down in the name of tradition or duty, the entire structure of our lives will eventually collapse. I had spent 28 years trying to be the foundation for people who only wanted to tear me down for the stone. I didn't lose a family, I just stopped feeding the parasites who wore that name. This freedom came at a high price, but it was worth every cent.